Eleanor Hayes clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she stared at the man across the table. The air in the dimly lit office felt suffocating, thick with cigar smoke and greed. Charles Whitmore, the man who had raised her under the guise of charity, leaned back in his leather chair, his expression unreadable. "You will marry Magnus Blackwell," he said, his voice flat, as if he were discussing the weather. Eleanor's breath hitched. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he continued, pouring himself a drink. The amber liquid swirled in the glass as he took a slow sip. "The debt is too high, Eleanor. Do you think we took you in for free? That we fed you, clothed you, out of kindness?" She had suspected there were strings attached. The Whitmores had never treated her as family, always keeping her at arm's length, reminding her of her place. But this was a level of betrayal she hadn't imagined. "You can't sell me off like a piece of property," she snapped. Charles chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not selling, darling. It's an arrangement. Magnus needs a wife. We need money. It's simple." Eleanor forced herself to breathe. Magnus Blackwell. The name alone sent a chill through her. A billionaire with a reputation as cold and ruthless as the steel empire he controlled. She'd seen his face in the newspapers. Dark eyes, sharp features, always devoid of warmth. He was a man people feared. She pushed back from the table, shaking her head. "I won't do it." "You will," Charles said, his voice like iron. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure you regret it. Do you think you have a choice? You have nowhere to go, Eleanor. No family, no money. I can make your life hell." A rush of helplessness flooded her, but she swallowed it down. "Why does Magnus need a wife?" Charles smirked. "That's not your concern. What matters is that he agreed. The wedding is in 3 days." Her mind spun, searching for a way out, but there was none. She had no one to turn to, no escape. The reality hit her like a hammer. Her life, her choices, none of it had ever truly belonged to her. As she walked out of the office, her legs felt unsteady. She had spent years surviving, believing she had some control over her future. But she was wrong. In 72 hours, she would be bound to a man she had never met, locked in a marriage that was nothing more than a transaction. And something told her Magnus Blackwell wouldn't be any kinder than the people selling her off. Eleanor stared at the closed doors, heart pounding as she heard faint whispers from the other side. Moments earlier, she had been surrounded by strangers who tugged at her hair, pinned a veil on her head, and slipped her into a gown that felt more like a cage than a symbol of celebration. She could feel the weight of the fabric against her skin, the prick of pins along her scalp, and the cold press of jewelry she never chose. Outside, music drifted through the hallway, signaling that the ceremony was moments away. She braced herself, reminding her legs to keep her upright. Charles Whitmore, who had insisted on escorting her, stood to her left. His presence was suffocating, yet she refused to let him see any tremor in her hands. She could almost hear his silent reminder. "You owe me, and this is how you pay." The tall doors swung open. Light flooded her eyes, forcing her to blink rapidly. A throng of well-dressed guests sat on rows of chairs, heads turning to get a better look at the bride. She spotted curious stares, some pitying, some disinterested. The arrangement was grand, the floral decorations extravagant, and somewhere at the far end of that polished marble aisle stood Magnus Blackwell. He didn't move when he saw her. His expression was carved from stone, his jaw set with controlled tension. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that accentuated his broad frame, making him look even more imposing than his newspaper photos suggested. Dark hair was combed back, not a strand out of place. His eyes were focused on her, but there was no trace of warmth in them. Charles touched her elbow, guiding her forward. Every click of her heels against the aisle felt too loud, too final. She tried to block out the judgment of the crowd. So many people, so many unfamiliar faces. She noticed a photographer circling around, snapping pictures of an event that was never meant to be a celebration of love. Upon reaching Magnus, Eleanor felt her pulse thunder. He offered no greeting, no show of affection. The officiant cleared his throat and addressed the crowd, but Eleanor tuned most of it out. She caught fragments of words like commitment and union, but they didn't apply to her. This was a transaction. Silence settled as the officiant looked at Magnus. Do you, Magnus Blackwell, take Eleanor Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife? Magnus gave a slight nod, voice controlled. I do. Her turn came next. The officiant repeated the question, eyes focused on her. She swallowed the lump in her throat, wishing she could walk away. But that was not an option. I do, she whispered. An assistant stepped forward with 2 rings on a small, velvet cushion. First, Magnus took one and slid it onto her finger. The metal felt cold against her skin. Then she picked up the other ring and placed it on his hand. She couldn't meet his eyes. When she finally raised her gaze, she found no comfort there. The officiant concluded, his voice louder, cheerier than necessary. You may seal your vows with a kiss. Magnus moved closer. A hush fell over the guests. She held her breath, bracing for contact, dreading it. His hand caught her chin, tilting her face up. His lips brushed hers, a brief touch devoid of affection. Applause broke out, but it felt hollow. He released her immediately. The officiant beamed and introduced them as husband and wife. People stood, clapping politely. The music rose again, signaling the conclusion of a short, impersonal ceremony. Before she could compose herself, Charles stepped in to congratulate the new couple, a triumphant glint in his eyes. Magnus offered his arm to Eleanor, though the gesture seemed forced. Together, they walked down the aisle toward the exit. The crowd parted, giving them passage. Eleanor felt trapped under the weight of so many gazes. She overheard whispers. She's pretty enough. Will he warm to her? Maybe it's a business move. None of the remarks surprised her, but each one stung. Once they were out of the ballroom, Magnus withdrew his arm. His voice was low and unemotional. We have a reception waiting, though I'd prefer not to waste time. She forced herself to hold his gaze. I'll do what's required. His eyes flickered. That's all anyone can expect from you. A short pause passed between them, neither sure how to act in this new reality. A moment later, a few guests spilled into the corridor, congratulating them both, offering empty pleasantries. Eleanor tried to play her part, responding with polite nods. Magnus remained curt, stepping aside as soon as the guests finished their compliments. They made their way toward a grand hall, where tables were set with crystal glasses and towering floral centerpieces. Servers drifted around with trays of champagne. Soft music played in the background. Over 100 people milled around, chatting in small clusters, all seemingly curious about the new couple. Eleanor spotted a table reserved for the bride and groom. Magnus went straight there, taking a seat without waiting for her. She forced herself to follow, her stomach twisting. Charles approached, wearing a smug smile. He offered a toast, raising a flute of champagne. To the happy couple, he announced, and a smattering of applause arose from the nearby guests. Neither bride nor groom lifted their glasses. Charles cleared his throat, feigning ignorance of the tension. This is a day to celebrate. Don't look so grim, Eleanor. You've landed yourself a husband most women would fight over. She didn't answer. Charles glanced at Magnus. I'll leave you two alone. Don't forget to smile for the cameras. He walked off, greeting business associates with an air of self-satisfaction. Magnus tapped his fingers on the table. I have a meeting after this. Keep the formalities brief. She managed a slight nod. Understood. An older woman, wearing too much jewelry, approached, beaming at Magnus. Magnus, darling, introduce me to your bride. He stood, offering a polite but reserved acknowledgement. Mrs. Emery, this is Eleanor. Mrs. Emery's gaze flicked over Eleanor, curiosity clear. Lovely to meet you, dear. I've known Magnus since he was a boy, so I'm thrilled to see him wed. She leaned in, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I know this may have been sudden, but don't worry. He'll soften once he gets used to you. Eleanor said nothing, simply nodding. The woman smiled brightly and wandered off. After countless introductions, forced smiles, and bland conversations, the crowd thinned. Magnus rose from his chair, addressing Eleanor without looking at her. We've fulfilled our obligations. Let's go. He led her to a sleek black car waiting outside. The driver opened the door, and Magnus gestured for her to enter. She settled onto the leather seat, forcing herself to breathe normally. When he climbed in beside her, he left plenty of space between them. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the venue and the remnants of their joyless celebration. Neither said a word. The silence carried more weight than any argument could. As the vehicle sped toward the Blackwell estate, Eleanor's mind churned. She was now his wife, yet she felt nothing like a partner. She had no idea what waited at the end of this drive, only that it couldn't be anything resembling home. Eleanor barely spoke throughout the drive. She sat rigid, hands folded on her lap, eyes fixed on the passing city lights that soon gave way to a quieter stretch of road. The tension between her and Magnus was palpable, filling the car like a low-level hum that never ceased. Whenever she risked a glance at him, he was staring straight ahead, jaw tight, shoulders tense. She wondered if he viewed this marriage with the same dread she felt, or if his silence was nothing more than cold indifference. They finally approached the towering gates of the Blackwell estate. Cast iron bars slid apart, revealing a long driveway lined with manicured trees. Lights illuminated the path, revealing glimpses of a sprawling mansion. As the car came to a halt, a uniformed attendant stepped forward to open the door. Magnus exited first, then offered a polite but impersonal gesture for Eleanor to follow. She climbed out, smoothing her dress, feeling dwarfed by the building that loomed before her. They entered through an ornate foyer paved with black and white marble. The space was grand, silent, and tinged with an air of authority that seemed to echo Magnus' presence. At the center stood a curved staircase with a gleaming banister. Thick rugs muffled the sound of footsteps, and overhead, a chandelier glittered like a frozen waterfall. A few staff members waited in a line, heads bowed, greeting the new couple. One man, older and dressed in a crisp suit, stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwell, Mrs. Blackwell," he said with a calm nod. "I am Mr. Larkin, the head of household staff. Allow me to welcome you." Magnus gave a terse nod. "Thank you, Larkin. Please show my wife to her room." Eleanor bristled at the way he said it. Her room. So much for newlyweds sharing a space. She supposed it was a small mercy that he didn't expect them to pretend otherwise. Mr. Larkin motioned for her to follow him up the grand staircase. Magnus stayed behind without another word. On the second floor, Mr. Larkin led her down a long corridor, opening one of the double doors. The room beyond was lavish. A large canopy bed, rich drapes, gilded mirrors. Everything matched in subdued tones of cream and gold, an opulent display of wealth. She stepped inside, her gaze drifting over a vanity set against one wall and a walk-in closet where a few garments had already been arranged. Mr. Larkin spoke softly. "If you need anything, Mrs. Blackwell, please use the intercom." He gestured toward a small panel on the wall. "Do you wish for anything at the moment? Perhaps a meal? A housekeeper to assist?" Eleanor's stomach churned at the thought of food. "No, thank you. I just need a moment alone." Mr. Larkin inclined his head. "Certainly." He shut the doors behind him, leaving Eleanor in silence. She removed her heels, letting out a shaky breath. The day had been nothing short of suffocating. She sank onto the bed, mind spinning over her new reality. Married to a man who barely acknowledged her presence. Living in a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. Answerable to staff who addressed her with a title she still couldn't quite believe. The clock on the bedside table showed it was well into the evening. Exhaustion weighed on her, yet she doubted sleep would come easily. There was too much to think about. Her future, the uncertain demands of her husband, the mounting dread in her chest. She found herself wishing she could bolt from this place and never look back, but there was nowhere to go. After a while, she slipped out of the wedding dress and found a robe in the closet. The gentle fabric was unfamiliar yet comfortable. Wandering over to the window, she looked out at a vast garden illuminated by soft lights. The property stretched further than she expected, with hedges and statues arranged in geometric patterns. She spotted a small fountain in the distance, water shimmering under the glow. A quiet knock startled her. She hesitated, then opened the door. It was Mr. Larkin again, holding a tablet. "Mr. Blackwell asked that I bring this to you," he said, offering the device. "He wants you to review the estate rules, household guidelines, and a schedule of social events you'll be expected to attend. Eleanor blinked, surprised by the formality. "Thank you," she murmured, taking the tablet. He stepped back, bowing his head politely. "If you have questions, feel free to ask. Shall I bring any refreshments?" "No, I'm fine," she said, though she doubted it was true. Mr. Larkin departed, leaving her alone with the device. She tapped the screen, a mixture of curiosity and dismay rolling over her. There, in precise bullet points, was an outline of everything a Blackwell spouse must know or adhere to: public appearances, charitable events, times when paparazzi might be present. It was more akin to a handbook for a corporate position than a guide for newlyweds. She skimmed through policies on confidentiality, etiquette guidelines, even dress codes for various gatherings. She thought about the wedding vow she had taken, how she'd answered with a shaky "I do," and how the day had felt more like a financial contract than the start of a life together. None of this looked like marriage. It looked like an assignment. Setting the tablet aside, she brushed a hand across her face, feeling a surge of frustration she could no longer ignore. She needed answers. If Magnus truly wanted a convenient partner, why the charade of a wedding? And why so many rules? With a newfound determination, she left her room, robe trailing behind her. She had no idea where to find him in this massive house, but she couldn't wait until morning to speak. Her bare feet made no sound against the plush carpet as she followed the hallway. Light fixtures on the walls cast a warm glow, revealing doors that all seemed identical. She tried several, finding mostly empty rooms or locked doors. Finally, she turned a corner and noticed a faint light spilling out from beneath a partially open door. She inched closer, pressing an ear against it. Inside, a low murmur of voices drifted out, Magnus and someone else, perhaps. A second later, the conversation stopped, and heavy footsteps moved across the room. Eleanor stepped back just as the door swung open. Magnus stood there, looking displeased. Behind him was a tall man in a black suit, his features sharp, his stance guarded. They both stared at her. She quickly tightened the belt of her robe, feeling suddenly exposed. Magnus' voice cut through the tense silence. "You should be in bed. Is there a reason you're roaming the house at this hour?" Her pulse thudded in her ears. "I need to speak with you." She glanced at the other man, uncertain if she should say more in front of him. Magnus turned slightly, addressing the stranger. "We'll finish this later." The man gave a curt nod, brushed past Eleanor without a word, and disappeared down the hallway. Magnus faced her, arms crossed. "Well?" Eleanor squared her shoulders, summoning courage she didn't quite feel. "I want to know what's expected of me." He raised an eyebrow. "You already have the tablet, don't you?" "That's not the same as talking face to face." She tried to keep her voice steady. "I don't want to guess what my role is here. I want to hear it directly from you." His gaze flicked over her, a flicker of annoyance clear in his eyes. "Fine, but not out here." He stepped back, letting her enter his study. She moved inside, noticing the shelves lined with leather-bound books, a mahogany desk piled with folders, and a single lamp casting a subdued glow. Magnus closed the door behind them. Eleanor breathed in, trying to steady her nerves. "Tell me why you chose me. Why you agreed to this arrangement." He gave a half-shrug, as though her question was barely worth answering. "Why else? Business, reputation, convenience. Nothing more." She swallowed her retort, determined not to let him goad her. "So I'm just a means to an end?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "In time, maybe you'll realize this is bigger than either of us." He turned away, and she sensed he wouldn't offer further explanations tonight. She considered pressing him further but decided against it. He seemed on edge, his mood shifting from cold to frigid in a matter of seconds. Forcing more questions might break what little civility they had. She opened the door, stepping out into the hallway before pausing. "If we're going to live under the same roof, we should at least try to understand each other." Magnus' shoulders stiffened. "Go to bed, Eleanor. We'll talk another time." She left, heart pounding, uncertain which was more daunting, the opulent mansion or the man who owned it. Eleanor woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. The heavy curtains blocked most of the morning light, leaving the room cloaked in soft shadows. She lay still, absorbing the silence of the house. It felt strange waking up somewhere unfamiliar, even more so knowing she was now bound to a man who barely acknowledged her existence. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples. The conversation with Magnus last night had left her with more questions than answers. He had been as cold as ever, offering nothing beyond vague hints that their marriage served a purpose bigger than either of them. But what purpose? And why her? Pushing off the blankets, she moved toward the bathroom. A hot shower helped clear her head, and when she emerged, a garment bag had been left on the bed. Someone, probably one of the staff, had placed it there without making a sound. She unzipped it to find a tailor dress, simple but elegant. There was no note, but she assumed it was for whatever obligation Magnus had scheduled for her today. After dressing, she stepped into the hallway, half expecting to see someone waiting to escort her, but the corridor was empty. She hesitated, unsure of where to go, before remembering the tablet Magnus had given her. Scrolling through it, she found an entry labeled, "Breakfast is served at 8 a.m. Dining hall. Attendance expected." So much for freedom. She followed the long hallway down a set of polished wooden stairs, trying to memorize the turn she took. The Blackwell estate was a maze, its halls lined with portraits of men who bore a striking resemblance to Magnus. Each figure was painted with the same cold, unyielding expression. When she reached the dining hall, she found Magnus already seated at the head of the table. A newspaper lay open in front of him, a steaming cup of coffee at his side. He barely acknowledged her presence as she took a seat at the far end. The table was absurdly long, covered in silver platters of fruit, eggs, toast, and meats. A maid poured her coffee, and Eleanor muttered a quiet "thank you" before reaching for a piece of toast. Silence stretched between them. Magnus continued reading as if she weren't even there. Eleanor exhaled, placing her cup down a little too forcefully. "Are we going to pretend this is normal?" Magnus didn't even look up. What part of this is not normal? A husband and wife having breakfast together? She let out a hollow laugh. "Oh, right. Just a regular married couple, sitting in a house we don't share, after a wedding neither of us wanted." Magnus folded the newspaper and finally met her gaze. "You agreed to this, Eleanor. No one forced you to say I do." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "You know damn well I didn't have a choice." A flicker of something, maybe amusement, maybe something else, crossed his face, but it was gone before she could place it. He took a sip of coffee. "Regardless, this is the life you have now. You might as well get used to it." She studied him, searching for any crack in his facade, but found nothing. His expression remained unreadable, his posture composed, as if this arrangement meant nothing to him. "I read the tablet," she said, changing tactics. "It's very thorough." He smirked. "I like efficiency." "Of course you do," she muttered. "So tell me, am I just here to smile at charity events and play the devoted wife in public?" For now, the simplicity of his answer sent a chill through her. Magnus set his cup down and pushed back his chair, standing smoothly. "I have business to attend to. Larkin will assist you with anything you need. You should explore the estate. Get familiar with your new home." She didn't miss the way he said "your new home," as if it wasn't his responsibility to make her feel welcome. He turned without another word and walked away, leaving her alone at the table. Eleanor huffed, stabbing a piece of fruit with her fork. Fine. If he wanted her to get familiar with the estate, she would. By the time she finished breakfast, the house was quiet. She wandered through the halls, glancing at the paintings, the antique furniture, the towering bookshelves filled with first editions. Everything was meticulously placed, as if the home had been designed to impress but never to be lived in. Eventually, she found herself in a library. It was massive, lined with dark wooden shelves stretching up to a domed ceiling. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows across the room. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, surprised to find they weren't just decorative. Many were well-worn, with creased pages and margin notes. Magnus read. That was an unexpected detail. A noise behind her made her turn. Mr. Larkin stood at the doorway, his hands clasped in front of him. "Mrs. Blackwell," he greeted with a polite nod. I hope you are settling in. Eleanor gave a small smile. Trying to. I was just exploring. He hesitated before stepping closer. If I may, there is something I believe you should see. Her brow furrowed. What is it? Mr. Larkin glanced toward the hallway, then back at her. Follow me. Curiosity prickled at her, but she nodded and followed him through a series of doors until they reached a part of the house she hadn't seen before. The hall was narrower, the wallpaper slightly older. It didn't match the pristine elegance of the rest of the mansion. Mr. Larkin stopped in front of a locked door. From his pocket, he pulled a key. This room has been closed for years, he said quietly. Eleanor frowned. Why? He hesitated. It belonged to Mr. Blackwell's father. Her heart skipped a beat. Before she could ask more, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of dust and aged wood. The room was untouched, frozen in time. A desk sat near the window, covered in scattered papers. A coat still hung over the chair, as if someone had intended to return but never did. Eleanor stepped inside cautiously. Why are you showing me this? Mr. Larkin's expression was unreadable. Because no one else will. A shiver crawled down her spine. She glanced at the desk, her fingers hovering over the papers. Among them, she spotted something that made her breath hitch. An old pocket watch. It was partially covered in dust, but the engraving on its surface was clear. T.B. Her pulse quickened. Theodore Blackwell. Magnus' father. Why had this been left here? Why had no one touched this room? Eleanor glanced at Mr. Larkin, but he was already stepping back. Take your time, Mrs. Blackwell. Then, without another word, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving her alone with the ghosts of the past, and with a feeling deep in her gut that told her this marriage, this house, and everything that came with it, was hiding more than she could have ever imagined. Eleanor stood motionless, her fingers hovering over the pocket watch. The silence of the room pressed in around her, thick with the weight of a past no one seemed willing to disturb. Dust coated every surface, as if time itself had stopped the moment Theodore Blackwell had last stood here. She exhaled slowly and picked up the watch, its metal cool against her palm. The engraving, TB, gleamed faintly in the dim light. She ran her thumb over the letters, her mind racing. Why had this been left behind when everything else in the house was so meticulously maintained? Why had this room been locked away, forgotten? Turning toward the desk, she swept her gaze over the scattered papers. Some were brittle with age, the ink faded, but a few seemed more recent. Her pulse quickened. She reached for one, careful not to disturb the others. It was a letter, unfinished. Magnus, if you're reading this, then I... The words cut off abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. Eleanor's throat tightened. Had Theodore been trying to tell Magnus something before he died? She flipped through the other documents, but most were unremarkable. Old business statements, receipts, notes scribbled in the margins of financial reports. Nothing that explained why this room had been sealed. A sudden creak made her spin around, heart hammering. The door was still slightly ajar, the dim hallway beyond empty. Had she imagined the sound? She held her breath, listening. The mansion was eerily quiet, but something about the air felt different, as if someone had been standing just outside, watching. Clutching the watch, she stepped back from the desk. She needed to think. If there were answers to be found, they weren't going to come from sifting through old papers alone. With one last glance at the room, she turned and walked out, shutting the door behind her. That evening, Eleanor found Magnus in his study. Unlike Theodore's abandoned office, this room was immaculate. Every book, every paper, every object perfectly placed. Magnus sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing documents, a half-empty glass of whiskey beside him. He didn't look up when she entered. If you're here to discuss appearances, Larkin can handle it. She ignored his dismissive tone. I want to talk about your father. That got his attention. His gaze lifted, dark and unreadable. What about him? Eleanor stepped closer, gripping the pocket watch in her palm. Why is his office locked? His expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, something sharp. Because he's dead. He has no use for it. She narrowed her eyes. That's not an answer. Every room in this house is pristine, yet his was left untouched, like it's been frozen in time. Magnus leaned back in his chair, regarding her with cool detachment. What exactly are you asking? She set the pocket watch on his desk. Did you know this was still there? His jaw tightened. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he picked up the watch, turning it over in his fingers. I thought it was lost, he admitted, his voice quieter than before. Eleanor crossed her arms. Then why was it sitting in his office, covered in dust? And why was there an unfinished letter on his desk? His grip on the watch tightened. A letter? She nodded. It was addressed to you, but it was never finished. What was he trying to tell you? Magnus exhaled through his nose, setting the watch back down with a soft clink. You should drop this, Eleanor. Her frustration flared. Why? Because you don't want to talk about it? Or because there's something you don't want me to know? He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Because it doesn't concern you. Eleanor refused to back down. It does if I'm living in this house. If I'm supposed to be your wife in the eyes of the world, I deserve to know what I've walked into. He let out a sharp laugh, devoid of humor. You walked into wealth, privilege, and security. You got exactly what was promised. She took a step closer. And yet, this house feels like a mausoleum. No one talks about your father. His room was locked away like a secret. What happened to him, Magnus? His expression darkened, the carefully maintained mask slipping just enough for her to see something underneath. Anger, pain, something he didn't want her to see. Finally, he said, he died. That's all you need to know. Eleanor studied him, realizing she wasn't going to get anything more tonight. But she had seen it, the hesitation, the way his fingers curled slightly when she mentioned the letter. Magnus Blackwell wasn't as unaffected as he wanted her to believe. She turned toward the door but paused. Secrets don't stay buried forever. Magnus, whatever happened to your father? It's still here, in this house. Whether you want to admit it or not. She didn't wait for a response. She walked out, closing the door softly behind her. As she moved through the empty hallway, a shiver ran down her spine. Something wasn't right about this house, and she was going to find out what. Eleanor didn't sleep. After leaving Magnus' study, she returned to her room, but the stillness of the mansion pressed down on her. The encounter had left her restless, her mind circling around everything she had discovered. Theodore Blackwell's locked office, the unfinished letter, the pocket watch Magnus had thought was lost, and most of all, the way Magnus had reacted when she pushed for answers. He wasn't just unwilling to talk about his father. He was hiding something. The mansion held secrets, but she wasn't naive enough to think she could uncover them on her own. She needed help, and she knew exactly who to ask. The next morning, Eleanor dressed quickly, pulling on a simple yet elegant outfit from the wardrobe that had been stocked for her. She had memorized the layout of the estate enough to know which doors to avoid, which hallways remained under surveillance, and which led to discreet exits. She walked with purpose toward the east wing, where she knew she would find Mr. Larkin. The head of household staff was standing near the conservatory, speaking quietly with a maid. At the sight of Eleanor, he dismissed the girl and gave a polite nod. Mrs. Blackwell. Eleanor didn't waste time. I need to speak with you. Privately. Larkin studied her for a moment, then gave a slight tilt of his head. Follow me. She trailed after him down a corridor she hadn't explored yet. It led to a smaller sitting room, tastefully decorated but lacking the grandiosity of the main house. Larkin closed the door behind them, his posture straight as ever. I assume this is about last night, he said. Eleanor met his gaze. Why did you show me that room? His expression remained neutral. Because you asked the right question. She exhaled sharply. And what's the right answer? Larkin walked to a small table and poured himself a glass of water. Mr. Blackwell's father was a powerful man. He built this estate, expanded the company, and shaped Magnus into who he is today. But not all legacies are clean. She crossed her arms. You're being vague. Larkin took a sip, then set the glass down. Some things are dangerous to say outright. A chill ran down her spine. Then give me something I can work with. He studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. Theodore Blackwell didn't just die. He disappeared before his body was ever found. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Disappeared? Larkin nodded. One night, he left the house. No security detail, no warning. He never returned. She thought back to the locked office, the abandoned papers. How long was he missing before they found him? Larkin's gaze darkened. 2 months. Eleanor's stomach turned. She had assumed Theodore had died suddenly. An accident, a heart attack, something explainable. But being missing for 2 months before turning up dead? That was something entirely different. Where did they find him? She asked. Larkin hesitated, then said, In the river. Miles from here. Eleanor swallowed hard. And Magnus? How did he react? Larkin's voice remained steady, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. He stopped asking questions. A cold shiver ran through her. Magnus knew more than he let on, and that meant someone had silenced him. Later that afternoon, Eleanor paced her room, thoughts racing. Theodore had vanished. His body had been found 2 months later in a river. Magnus had stopped asking questions. And now, the man she had married was determined to keep her in the dark. She knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stop now. She had to find out what really happened to Theodore Blackwell. And if Magnus wasn't going to tell her, she would uncover the truth herself. Eleanor spent the rest of the afternoon locked in her room, her mind tangled in the puzzle of Theodore Blackwell's disappearance. The revelation had changed everything. 2 months unaccounted for. A body found in the river. A son who had stopped asking questions. She needed more. More than whispers from the staff. More than the vague warnings Mr. Larkin had given her. And if Magnus wouldn't talk, she'd find another way. That night, the mansion was quiet. The staff had retired to their quarters, and Magnus had vanished somewhere in the house. Eleanor wasn't sure if he had meetings, or simply wanted to avoid her, but she didn't care. It worked in her favor. Dressed in comfortable flats and a simple sweater, she stepped out of her room, her footsteps light against the carpeted hallway. She didn't need a map this time. She knew exactly where she was going. Theodore's office. She had barely scratched the surface when she first stepped inside, too overwhelmed by the dust-covered remnants of a life frozen in time. Now, she was ready to dig deeper. The corridor leading to the locked room was empty. The shadows stretched long, cast by the dim sconces lining the walls. She hesitated for only a moment before gripping the doorknob. Locked. Of course. Her mind worked quickly. Mr. Larkin had used a key before, but Eleanor doubted he had left it lying around. And she wasn't about to ask for it. She stepped back, glancing around the hall. If Magnus had inherited anything from his father, it was his obsession with control. And if control was what ruled this house, that meant security. A spare key had to exist. She turned on her heel, making her way back down the hall, past the grand staircase, and toward Magnus' study. It was late, but she had no idea if he was inside. If he caught her searching his office, she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. She pressed her ear against the heavy wooden door. Silence. Taking a steadying breath, she turned the handle. Unlocked. Slipping inside, she closed the door softly behind her. The study smelled of leather and expensive cologne, the air still carrying the faint trace of whiskey from earlier. A lamp on the desk cast a dim glow over neatly arranged documents. A few books lay open, a pen resting on the pages as if he had been interrupted. Eleanor wasted no time. She moved behind the desk, pulling open drawers. Files. Business contracts. Investment records. Nothing useful. Her fingers trailed along the edges of the compartments, feeling for anything hidden. Then, a smaller drawer, locked. Her pulse kicked up. If something was locked in Magnus' own study, it had to be important. She scanned the desk, searching for a key. There was nothing obvious, but Magnus wasn't careless. He wouldn't leave something critical out in the open. Her eyes flicked to the bookshelf behind the desk. Stepping closer, she ran her fingers along the spines of the books, checking for anything that seemed out of place. And then, just slightly off-center, she found it. An old leather-bound volume that didn't quite sit flush with the others. She tugged it. It didn't move. Her breath caught. It wasn't a book. It was part of a mechanism. She pressed against it, applying more pressure. A soft click echoed through the room. One of the lower panels of the bookshelf shifted slightly. Eleanor crouched, pulling the small compartment open. Inside, nestled among a few old papers, was a single key. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed it and turned back to the locked drawer in the desk. Holding her breath, she slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly. The drawer opened with a soft snick. Inside was a black folder. Eleanor pulled it out and flipped it open. Her stomach dropped. A death certificate. Theodore Blackwell. Date of death, 2 months after his disappearance. But that wasn't what sent ice through her veins. It was the cause of death. Undetermined. Not drowning. Not natural causes. Not an accident. Undetermined. Which meant someone had kept the truth buried. And Magnus knew. Her hands tightened on the folder. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around her. She had walked into this marriage blind, believing she was nothing more than a pawn in a business deal. But now, she knew better. The Blackwell name wasn't just built on wealth. It was built on secrets. And she was standing in the middle of one. A noise outside the study made her snap the folder shut. Her breath hitched. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. Magnus. She shoved the folder back into the drawer, locked it, and placed the key back in its hidden slot in the bookshelf. Just as the doorknob turned, Eleanor spun around, forcing herself to look composed just as Magnus stepped inside. He took one look at her and froze. His eyes darkened. "What are you doing in here?" Eleanor willed her pulse to slow. She needed to think fast. "I was looking for you." His gaze flickered to the desk, then back to her. Suspicion crept into his expression. "At this hour?" She tilted her chin up. "You told me we should talk another time." "It's another time." Magnus studied her, his silence stretching between them like a taut wire. She had to get out of this room before he noticed something was off. He exhaled sharply and closed the door behind him. "Whatever it is, it can wait until morning." Eleanor forced a slow breath. "Fine." Without another word, she stepped past him, her heart pounding. She could feel his gaze on her back as she walked away. She didn't stop until she reached her room, shutting the door behind her. Only then did she let out the breath she had been holding. She had just stepped into dangerous territory, and Magnus Blackwell was more than just a man with secrets. He was a man guarding them. And now, Eleanor had to decide what she was going to do with the truth. Eleanor barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Theodore Blackwell's death certificate burned behind her eyelids. Undetermined. The word gnawed at her like a whisper of something too dark to name. Morning came too soon. Sunlight filtered through the heavy drapes, casting slanted beams across her room. She sat up, her body stiff from lying awake all night. The weight of what she had discovered settled into her bones. Magnus knew something about his father's death, something he didn't want anyone to uncover. And now, Eleanor wasn't sure if he had already figured out that she was digging into it. She forced herself to go about the morning as if nothing had changed, slipping into another perfectly tailored dress that had been selected for her. If Magnus suspected anything, she couldn't let him see it. When she arrived at breakfast, he was already at the table, flipping through his newspaper, a steaming cup of coffee beside him. He didn't acknowledge her as she sat down. The tension was suffocating. Eleanor's fingers curled around the edge of her napkin as she debated how to play this. If she brought up his father, he would shut her down immediately. But if she pushed too hard, he might start asking questions of his own. So she tried something different. "You never mentioned we had a dinner engagement tonight," she said, keeping her tone light. Magnus barely looked up. "Because you don't need to know everything in advance." Her grip on the napkin tightened. "That's convenient for you, isn't it?" He turned a page in his newspaper. "If you have an issue with our arrangements, take it up with the staff." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "I was under the impression that as your wife, I should at least be briefed on my schedule." Finally, he set the newspaper down, leveling her with a cool stare. "Your role is to stand beside me when required, smile when necessary, and keep your curiosity in check." There it was. A warning. Subtle, but unmistakable. He knew she had been looking where she shouldn't. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Curiosity isn't a crime, Magnus." His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. That depends entirely on what you're curious about. The message was clear. Back off. Eleanor took a slow sip of coffee, forcing herself to remain composed. She had no intention of backing off. The dinner engagement that evening was a tedious affair. Eleanor found herself seated beside Magnus at an impossibly long dining table in a high-rise restaurant, surrounded by men in tailored suits and women in designer gowns, all discussing business deals worth more than most people made in a lifetime. She was expected to play her part, to smile at the right moments, offer polite conversation, and fade into the background whenever the men talked. It was suffocating. Across the table, a woman with sleek blonde hair and sharp blue eyes studied her. She was beautiful in a way that was calculated, every movement deliberate. When she finally spoke, it was with an air of casual amusement. "So, Eleanor," she said, swirling the wine in her glass, "how does it feel to be married to the most ruthless man in the city?" Magnus didn't react, but Eleanor saw the slight shift in his grip on his fork. She smiled, matching the woman's energy. "I suppose that depends on your definition of ruthless." The blonde woman's lips curved. "Oh, I think we both know exactly what that word means." Eleanor held her gaze, feeling the undercurrent of something unspoken. Who was this woman? Magnus finally broke his silence. "Eleanor, this is Cassandra Vaughn." The name sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. Vaughn. She had heard it before. Somewhere in the estate records, in the history of the Blackwell family empire, the Vaughns had been close to the Blackwells once. Partners, allies, then enemies. Cassandra's gaze flickered between them, as if reading something beneath the surface. Then she smirked. "I must say, Magnus, I never thought you'd be the type to marry. You were always so." She paused, taking a sip of wine. "Detached." Eleanor watched Magnus carefully, but his expression remained impassive. "Things change," he said smoothly. Cassandra hummed in amusement. "Do they?" The rest of dinner passed in a blur of conversation Eleanor barely processed, but she felt the tension. It lingered like a silent storm, wrapping around her like a warning. Later that night, back at the estate, Eleanor stepped out of the car before Magnus, needing to breathe. The cool night air was a relief against the heat of the evening. She walked ahead toward the entrance, but a voice stopped her. "Curiosity will get you into trouble, Eleanor." She turned. Cassandra Vaughn stood a few feet away, arms crossed, a knowing smile on her lips. Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Is that a threat?" Cassandra tilted her head. "A warning. There are things in this house better left buried. Questions better left unasked." Eleanor stepped closer. "And yet, you seem very interested in my curiosity." Cassandra let out a quiet laugh. "I don't have to be interested to know how this ends. I've seen it before." Eleanor swallowed. "Seen what?" Cassandra held her gaze for a long moment before saying, "You think you married a man. You didn't." A cold chill ran through Eleanor. Cassandra stepped back, heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward her waiting car. Before getting in, she glanced over her shoulder. "Be careful, Eleanor. Magnus Blackwell isn't the only danger in that house." The car door shut, and within moments, she was gone. Eleanor stood frozen, the weight of Cassandra's words pressing down on her. And as Magnus finally approached from behind, his presence unmistakable, she knew one thing with certainty. The secrets surrounding his father's death weren't the only ones lurking in the shadows of the Blackwell estate. And she was running out of time to figure out who, or what, she had really married. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps as she stepped back from the balcony railing. The figure in the garden was gone, swallowed by the night. But the chill in her bones remained. Someone had been watching the house. Watching her. She turned sharply, gripping the cool iron handle of the balcony doors and stepping inside. The warmth of the room did nothing to calm her nerves. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was it a servant? A security guard? Or someone with far worse intentions? She needed to tell Magnus. But the thought of going to him, of admitting she had seen something that could be nothing, or worse, something very real, made her hesitate. He had warned her to stop digging. Would he even believe her? No. Magnus had already made it clear that she was on her own. Eleanor exhaled sharply and forced herself to think. If she couldn't go to him, She had to find answers herself. The next morning, she left her room earlier than usual, determined to follow up on the night before. She needed to see the garden in daylight, to confirm that there had been someone there. The estate grounds stretched farther than she had realized, sprawling with hedges, fountains, and statues that had likely stood untouched for decades. The staff kept the paths pristine, but there was an eerie stillness to it, as if something had been lurking just beyond sight. As she walked, she caught sight of Mr. Larkin near one of the trimmed bushes, directing a group of workers. She approached quickly. "Mrs. Blackwell," he greeted with a polite nod. "Out for a morning stroll?" Eleanor ignored the pleasantries. "Did anyone report seeing a stranger on the grounds last night?" Larkin's expression didn't change, but there was a brief pause before he answered. "Not that I'm aware of." "Why do you ask?" She studied him. "Because I saw someone. A man. He was standing near the hedges, watching the house." Larkin's gaze flickered toward the garden before returning to her. "Are you sure it wasn't one of the staff?" "No one stands perfectly still in the shadows for no reason," she said firmly. Larkin's hands clasped behind his back. "I'll have security check the perimeter. But I assure you, Mrs. Blackwell, this estate is well guarded. No one gets in without permission." Eleanor wasn't convinced. She nodded but made a mental note to check on the security cameras herself. If Magnus had any surveillance on the estate, she needed to see the footage. Later that evening, Eleanor found herself in the same place she had sworn she wouldn't return to, Magnus' study. But this time, she wasn't searching for hidden documents. She needed access to the security locks. The house had cameras. She had seen them mounted discreetly in the hallways, positioned at the grand entrance. And if there were cameras inside, there had to be some outside. Magnus had gone out for the evening. He hadn't told her where. She wasn't waiting for his permission. She moved behind his desk, opening drawers quickly but carefully. She didn't have time to be cautious. Halfway through searching, she found what she was looking for: an internal security access panel built into the desk itself. The sleek black screen came to life with a single touch, flashing the Blackwell Estate security system emblem before prompting a passcode. Eleanor cursed under her breath. Of course it was locked. She drummed her fingers against the desk, thinking fast. Magnus wasn't the kind of man who used easily guessed passwords, but he was the kind of man who needed efficiency. She glanced at the whiskey glass still sitting on his desk, at the newspaper he had left open, and at the small pocket watch he had set aside the day before. Magnus Blackwell wasn't sentimental, but he held on to the past. Theodore's death had shaped him. It had changed him. Eleanor exhaled, then typed in the year of Theodore Blackwell's death. The screen unlocked. She didn't have time to feel victorious. She quickly pulled up the security logs from last night, scrolling through the outdoor camera feeds until she found the one facing the hedges near the garden. Her stomach tightened. There. The footage was grainy in the dark, but she saw the figure. Tall, unmoving, exactly where she had seen it. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Not walked away, not turned, just disappeared. The screen flickered. Eleanor frowned. She tried to rewind the footage, but the screen glitched again, freezing for a moment before resetting back to the main menu. Something was wrong. Someone had tampered with the footage. A cold realization settled over her. Whoever had been in the garden last night, they weren't just watching. They were covering their tracks. Eleanor barely had time to process the discovery before she heard the front doors open. Magnus was back. She quickly exited out of the security system, shut the drawer, and stepped away from the desk just as the study door opened. Magnus strode in, his expression unreadable. He was still in his suit, but his tie was loosened, and his sleeves were rolled up. His sharp gaze landed on her. "Are you lost?" Eleanor forced herself to remain calm. "I was looking for you." Magnus arched a brow. "In my office?" "You weren't answering your phone," she lied smoothly. "And I needed to talk to you." He leaned against the desk, arms crossing. "About?" She hesitated. If she told him about the security footage, he would know she had accessed his system. And if she revealed that the footage had been tampered with, she had no idea how he would react. Instead, she chose her words carefully. "There was someone outside last night," she said, "watching the house." Something flickered in Magnus' eyes. For the first time since their marriage, she saw a reaction she hadn't seen before. Not indifference, not annoyance, concern. It was gone just as fast. He straightened, his expression smoothing into something unreadable again. "You're certain?" "Yes," she said. "And I don't think it was a mistake." Magnus studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide how much to tell her. Then, finally, he exhaled. "Stay away from the gardens at night." Her brow furrowed. "That's it? That's your advice?" His jaw tightened. "Drop it, Eleanor." She stepped forward. "Who was out there?" He didn't answer. Instead, he moved to pour himself a drink, as if the conversation was over. Eleanor's hands curled into fists. She had seen it in his eyes. Magnus Blackwell knew exactly who had been watching, and that terrified her more than the stranger ever could. Eleanor barely touched her food at breakfast. Her mind was too preoccupied with the security footage, with Magnus' reaction, and with the gnawing feeling that the walls of the Blackwell estate were closing in on her. Magnus had known exactly who was watching the house. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't even seemed surprised. And yet, he had chosen to say nothing, leaving her with only a vague warning to stay away from the gardens at night. That wasn't good enough. If someone had been out there, if someone had erased the security footage, then this wasn't just a coincidence. It was a threat, and Magnus' silence only proved that he was hiding something much bigger than she had originally thought. The question was, how far was she willing to go to uncover the truth? She spent the morning in the library, flipping through old newspaper articles, scanning through Blackwell history as if she could find some hidden clue in the ink. There were plenty of stories about Theodore Blackwell, his business empire, his charitable donations, his public appearances. But none of it told her what really mattered. What had happened the night he disappeared? The official reports stated he had gone missing, only for his body to be found in the river 2 months later. No explanation, no arrests, undetermined cause of death. And yet, Magnus had stopped asking questions. Why? As she turned another page in a business magazine featuring the Blackwell family, she caught sight of a familiar name in an old article. Alastair Vaughn. Her breath hitched. Cassandra Vaughn's father. The article was from nearly a decade ago, detailing a business partnership between Theodore Blackwell and Alastair Vaughn. The two men had been allies, until something changed. The next article she found was from 2 years later. Blackwell Industries cuts ties with Vaughn Corporation amid scandal. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she skimmed the article. It was vague, but it hinted at a falling out. Theodore Blackwell had severed all connections with Alastair Vaughn's company, dissolving their decades-long partnership. No explanation was given, but the tone of the report was clear. Whatever had happened between them had not been amicable. She leaned back in her chair, gripping the page tightly. The Vaughns. They had been close to the Blackwells, and then suddenly, they weren't. And now, Cassandra Vaughn had appeared at dinner, issuing vague warnings, telling Eleanor that Magnus wasn't the only danger in the house. Was that a coincidence? Eleanor didn't believe in coincidences anymore. That evening, she found Magnus in his study. He was behind his desk, as always, sleeves rolled up, eyes scanning a document with his usual unwavering focus. But when she entered, he looked up. He didn't seem surprised to see her. Eleanor shut the door behind her. "We need to talk." Magnus set his pen down. "I assumed we would." She crossed the room, placing the newspaper clipping in front of him. "Tell me about Alastair Vaughn." His expression remained unreadable. He barely even glanced at the article. "Where did you find this?" "In the library," she said, "where a lot of things about your father's past seem to be conveniently hidden." He exhaled slowly, as if considering his next words carefully. "Alastair Vaughn and my father were business partners once. Then they weren't. End of story." Eleanor scoffed. "You and I both know that's not the end of the story." He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "And why exactly are you so interested in Vaughn?" "Because his daughter seems very interested in me," Eleanor said evenly. "Cassandra Vaughn warned me. She said you weren't the only danger in this house." Something shifted in Magnus' expression. It was brief, so quick that Eleanor almost missed it. But it was there. Recognition. He knew what Cassandra meant. He was just refusing to say it. Eleanor stepped closer. "What did your father do to Alastair Vaughn?" Magnus exhaled sharply, then stood, crossing the room toward the bar cart. He poured himself a drink, but didn't take a sip. Instead, he said, "You think this is about business, Eleanor?" "It's not." She frowned. "Then what is it about?" Magnus turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Loyalty, betrayal, and consequences. The weight of those words sent a chill through her. Eleanor took a slow breath. "Your father cut ties with Vaughn. Then, not long after, he disappeared." Magnus didn't respond. "You stopped asking questions, Magnus," she continued. "But I won't." He studied her for a long moment, then finally said, "You should." She shook her head. "I don't believe for a second that you're as indifferent as you pretend to be. This isn't just about your father's death. It's about who was responsible." Magnus' jaw clenched. She had him cornered. But instead of answering, he set down his glass, walking past her toward the door. Before he left, he said one last thing. "Alistair Vaughn was the last person to see my father alive." Then he was gone. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding. Alistair Vaughn, the man Theodore had betrayed, the man who had a reason to make him disappear. And now, his daughter was circling like a vulture. Eleanor had been looking for answers, but she had just uncovered something far worse. This wasn't just about Magnus' past. This was a game of power. A war started years ago, and now she was caught in the middle. Eleanor sat in her room long after Magnus had left, staring blankly at the darkened window. Alistair Vaughn was the last person to see Theodore Blackwell alive. The implication was clear. If Vaughn had something to do with Theodore's death, then Cassandra's sudden reappearance wasn't just a coincidence. It was a calculated move. But why now? And why was she so interested in Eleanor? The pieces were shifting too quickly, and the feeling that she was being pulled into something far more dangerous than a failed business partnership clawed at her chest. She needed to know the truth before it was too late. The next day, Eleanor decided she was done waiting for answers to come to her. If she wanted them, she had to start looking in places Magnus wouldn't approve of. Larkin was her best chance. She found him in the East Wing, overseeing a staff member polishing one of the many chandeliers in the hallway. He acknowledged her with his usual composed nod, but didn't pause his instructions. When he finally turned to face her, she got straight to the point. "I need to know everything about Alistair Vaughn." A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. "That's a name I haven't heard in years." Eleanor folded her arms. "That's a lie." Larkin exhaled. "Mrs. Blackwell." "I know he was the last person to see Magnus' father alive," she interrupted. "I know their business relationship ended badly, and I know Cassandra Vaughn didn't just show up for social reasons." Larkin studied her for a long moment. Then he finally spoke. "If you know that much, then you should know asking questions about Vaughn is dangerous." "I don't care," she said. "Tell me what happened." He sighed, glancing down the hall as if making sure no one else was around. Then, lowering his voice, he said, "Theodore Blackwell and Alistair Vaughn weren't just business partners. They were friends. For years. But something changed. Vaughn did something. Or maybe it was your father-in-law who betrayed him. No one knows the full truth." Eleanor frowned. "Someone does. Someone had to know why they cut ties." Larkin hesitated again. "There were rumors." She leaned in. "What kind of rumors?" Larkin's gaze darkened. "That Alistair Vaughn wanted Theodore dead." A shiver ran down her spine. Larkin continued, his voice quieter now. "The night Theodore disappeared, he left the estate alone. No security, no car. He was supposed to meet Vaughn." Eleanor's pulse pounded. "And he never came back." Larkin gave a slow nod. She swallowed hard. "But why wasn't Vaughn ever accused?" Larkin's expression turned unreadable. "Because no one was willing to go after him. Not even Magnus." Eleanor let that settle in her mind. Magnus. Her husband had let it go. Or had he? That evening, Eleanor wasn't sure what she expected when she found Magnus in his study again. He was seated behind his desk, fingers pressing against his temple as he read through documents. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "You knew Alistair Vaughn was responsible for your father's death?" Magnus didn't look up. "I never said that." "You didn't have to," she shot back. "You knew. And yet you never did anything about it." At that, he finally met her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was dangerously low when he spoke. You think I just let my father's murderer walk free? Eleanor's stomach twisted. Didn't you? Magnus stood abruptly, rounding the desk until he was only a few feet from her. Be very careful with your accusations, Eleanor. She refused to back down. You stopped asking questions. Magnus let out a harsh laugh, but there was no humor in it. Because I already knew the answer. Eleanor's breath caught. Then why didn't you do anything? His jaw tightened. Because power doesn't work the way you think it does. She stared at him, trying to understand the storm raging beneath his calm exterior. If Vaughn was responsible, she said carefully, then why wasn't he taken down? Magnus exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Because my father wasn't innocent, Eleanor. The words sent a chill through her. What are you saying? She whispered. Magnus' expression darkened. I'm saying my father and Vaughn weren't so different. You keep looking for a villain in this story, but you don't understand. There are no heroes here. Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. If Magnus wasn't lying, if Theodore Blackwell wasn't as innocent as she thought, then what really happened that night? Before she could ask, Magnus' gaze hardened. This is your last warning, Eleanor. Her pulse quickened. Warning? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Stop looking. Because if you don't, you won't like what you find. Eleanor swallowed hard. This wasn't just about uncovering the past. This was about surviving it. And for the first time since stepping into the Blackwell estate, she wasn't sure if she would. Eleanor felt the weight of Magnus' warning settle deep in her chest. You won't like what you find. It was too late for that. She had already seen too much, asked too many questions. And Magnus, her husband, was standing in front of her, his expression dark, unreadable. She should have been afraid. Instead, she was furious. Why are you protecting them? She demanded. Magnus exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. You think this is about protection? He shook his head. You have no idea what you've stepped into. Then tell me, she shot back. Because the way I see it, you had every opportunity to make Vaughn pay for what happened to your father, and you did nothing? Magnus' jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You think I don't want answers? You think I don't already know what happened that night? Eleanor's breath caught. He knew. He had known this entire time. Magnus took a slow step forward. You've been chasing ghosts, Eleanor. But the truth? It's not some grand conspiracy. It's simple. Her pulse pounded. Then say it. His gaze locked onto hers. My father wasn't murdered. The words hit like a slap. Eleanor shook her head. That doesn't make sense. He disappeared. His body was found months later. The death certificate. Magnus cut her off. Said undetermined cause of death. Not homicide. She struggled to make sense of it. Then why did everyone suspect Vaughn? Magnus let out a humorless laugh. Because he wanted my father dead. And my father wanted him dead. But neither of them got what they wanted. Eleanor's mind spun. Then what happened? Magnus' expression turned cold. My father didn't just disappear that night. He ran. The room tilted. Eleanor tried to process what he was saying. Theodore Blackwell, the man who built an empire, the man who had seemed untouchable, had run? Magnus stepped closer. He left this house, went to meet Vaughn, and something went wrong. Maybe they fought. Maybe they came to some agreement. But what I know for sure is that he didn't come back because he didn't want to. Eleanor's stomach twisted. You're saying he staged his own disappearance? Yes. Her mind reeled. Then how did he end up in the river? Magnus' lips pressed into a thin line. That's the part one don't know. Eleanor inhaled sharply. And you never tried to find out? His gaze hardened. I spent years searching for the truth. Years. And every lead ended the same way. Nowhere. No witnesses, no proof, just speculation. And then I realized. He exhaled slowly. Some questions don't need answers. Eleanor felt like the ground beneath her had cracked open. This entire time, she had been convinced Magnus was hiding the truth, that he had chosen to ignore what had happened to his father. But the truth was worse. He had tried to uncover it, and he had failed. Eleanor shook her head. I don't believe that. Someone knows what happened to him. Magnus' expression darkened. If they do, They've made sure no one finds out. The realization settled over her like a cold wave. This wasn't just about the past. It wasn't just about Theodore Blackwell's disappearance. It was about power, control, silence. And Eleanor had spent too much time asking the wrong questions. Because now, someone was watching her too. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every conversation. Magnus might have stopped searching, but she wouldn't. She couldn't. Because someone was still watching the Blackwell estate. Someone had erased the security footage. Someone had been in the garden. And if Theodore had made enemies before his death, then Eleanor had just inherited them. The next morning, Eleanor made a decision. She was going to meet Cassandra Vaughn. She left the estate without telling Magnus, knowing he would try to stop her. Cassandra was waiting for her. The Vaughn estate was just as grand as the Blackwell mansion, but there was something different about it. Colder, emptier. Cassandra greeted her at the entrance, her blue eyes gleaming with something between amusement and pity. "You finally came," she mused, leading Eleanor inside. "I was wondering how long it would take." Eleanor didn't sit. "Tell me what really happened to Theodore Blackwell." Cassandra tilted her head. "That depends. What has Magnus told you?" "That his father ran," Eleanor said carefully. "That he disappeared on his own." Cassandra smirked. "That's almost true." Eleanor's chest tightened. "Then tell me the rest." Cassandra leaned back against a marble table, crossing her arms. "Your husband wants to believe his father ran. Because the truth is worse." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Worse how?" Cassandra's gaze sharpened. "He didn't just run, Eleanor. He was running from something." The room suddenly felt too small. Eleanor forced herself to speak. "From what?" Cassandra smiled. "That's the real question, isn't it?" Eleanor clenched her fists. "You know the answer." Cassandra stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Alistair Vaughn didn't kill Theodore Blackwell." Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. Cassandra continued, her voice laced with quiet amusement. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" Eleanor's mind raced. If Vaughn wasn't responsible, then someone else was. Someone still in the shadows. Cassandra leaned in slightly. "If I were you, Eleanor, I'd stop looking before you end up like him." Eleanor took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain steady. "I don't scare easily." Cassandra smiled again. That's what he thought too. She let the words settle, then gestured toward the door. "I think we're done here." Eleanor didn't argue. She turned and walked out of the Vaughn estate, her pulse pounding in her ears. As soon as she stepped outside, she pulled out her phone. She had only one call to make. Magnus answered on the first ring. "Where the hell are you?" His voice was sharp, controlled. Eleanor gripped the phone tightly. "You were wrong." A pause. "About what?" She took a breath. "Your father didn't just run." Another pause. This time, longer. Then Magnus' voice came low, barely above a whisper. "I know." The line went dead. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She had walked straight into the storm. And now, there was no turning back.